Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting, Dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our lecture with Professor Emeritus Spiro Pollalis, Sustainability and Climate Change. First, a quick reminder about some features that you'll see in this Zoom webinar. Professor Pollalis will respond to questions after he's finished his lecture, so feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Someone actually already has submitted a question, so we're off to the races, which is great, but submit questions at any time. We also have live captioning available for this event, so to enable captions, please click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. Tomorrow, October 5th at 6:30 p.m., please join us for our annual Loeb Lecture, which will be a performance by writer and poet Reginald Dwayne Betts, who will explore the challenges of living in the shadow of mass incarceration. And this weekend, beginning at noon Cambridge Mass time on Friday, October 8th, the GSD's African American Student Union hosts Black in Design 2021 Black Matter, a conference that will celebrate Black design and creativity from the magical to the mundane. All GSD events will happen virtually this semester and require attendees to register in advance. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. And now for today's event. So we all know that President Biden's $1 trillion infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, is currently stalled in the House after passing the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan approval this past August. This bill bears some resemblance to, but is not the same thing as, the Green New Deal resolution that was introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and our own Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey in 2019. So we can discuss in the Q&A to what extent the infrastructure bill is green and to what extent it compares to Roosevelt's New Deal of almost a century ago. The bipartisan infrastructure bill includes $550 billion in new federal investment in America's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, airports, trains, and electric vehicles, among other hard infrastructures. We have the ideal expert today among us to discuss why infrastructure needs to be sustainable and resilient and what it means for infrastructure to be sustainable and resilient. How do we even measure that? Now emeritus, Spiro Pollalis was previously professor of design, technology, and management at the Graduate School of Design, which he joined in 1986, if I remember correctly. His research output includes Gulf sustainable urbanism, among many other projects. Spiro is the director of the GSD's Zofnass Program for Sustainability of Infrastructure, which has developed the Envision rating system and the planning guidelines for sustainable cities. We'll hear more about Envision in this lecture, I'm sure. He is taught as a visiting professor at Uni Stuttgart, TU Delft, and the ETH in Zurich. Mindful of our short time, I won't possibly try to list his many books, articles, and lectures. In his private practice, Spiro consults worldwide on sustainability, urbanism, and management. He's a consultant to the GSA, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, UNEP, the NRCC, and the Greek government. He's led the National Urban Assessment of Pakistan and has planned sustainable cities in Asia, including the DHA city Karachi, which is currently under construction. Spiro received his first degree from the University in Athens and his master's and PhD down the street at MIT. He also has an MBA in technology from Northeastern University and an honorary master's degree in architecture from our own institution. Please join me in welcoming my friend Spiro here today from Greece. And I am trying to tone down the level of jealousy in my voice when I note that fact that he is zooming into us from Greece. Please join me in welcoming him here to discuss sustainability and climate change from science to design. Thank you, Spiro, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the very kind introduction. From all your introduction, I'm simply going to say, thank you, my friend Sarah. it is a great opportunity to talk to the students. And we certainly live in very strange times. And I say that because I was in Boston about 40 hours ago, and I flew to Greece to give this lecture, among other things, of course, when I heard that I cannot have a live audience, as I was hoping to give this presentation in paper. So probably at another time. Let me also continue and say it's very timely that we talk about sustainability these days because of what happens in Washington. However, I would like to say that the main focus of what is going on in Washington is to create jobs and to stimulate the economy. And also to help us because we need more infrastructure. However, I do not see the attention to make the new infrastructure sustainable and consider what is going to happen in the next generations. So we have an obligation to push more, and when the bill is approved, to have the caveats in it so that what is being built is going to last 100 years, not only in terms of durability, but in terms of sustainability. So having said that, let me start sharing my screen, and I share my screen as a portion of my screen. It's going to take a minute. So I start with my first screen. And as you see, I call it from science to design. Why to design? It's obvious. We're in a design school, we're designers, this is where we need to go. From science has been influenced by what is happening recently, that there is a tendency in our society, by a large portion of it, not to pay attention to science. And this is really unthinkable for the 21st century of America. So when I say science here, I mean base it on research, on observation, and on scientific findings, and then proceed to design. I go to the next slide. And talking about science, here we see a century of climate data. On the left, the first 50 years, on the right, the last 50 years. And we see the difference in temperature. It is real. And not only the temperature is real, but the natural phenomena that they really affect very many people. Wildfires, floodings. People need to be evacuated with fishing boats and ferries to avoid the inferno of fires that they were burning for 10 days in an area that had unprecedented temperatures of 128 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's not only the natural catastrophes. It is that the climate change is a geopolitical threat, as all these phenomena displace populations, and famine and disease destabilize governments. The special presidential envoy for climate change says the climate crisis is just that. It is crisis, but this is also a national security issue. Of course, you know the good news. And the good news is that now we have an executive order that the United States has re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement. And also there is an advisory council on environmental justice. Furthermore, the US has been announcing to reduce its greenhouse gas pollution. I can tell you these are music to my ear, because as I travel to the world, I was always pointed out, you're talking about all these things. What are you doing in your country? So the question now comes, having all observed all these things, and you observe them daily on the newspapers and the press, what designers can do? And when I say what designers can do, I mean what can you do? And when I say you, I mean the GSD students more than anybody else. So I ask you to do three things. First, base your decisions on evidence. Base your actions on evidence. Then adapt industry standards and quantify your actions. And work together with other disciplines. It is not enough for the designer to carry the entire sustainability and climate action. So you should design sustainably. But what do we mean by that? We all know that the word sustainability has been misused to a large extent. The way I define sustainability, which of course is 30 years old definition and comes from very respected world organizations, is to improve the quality of human life with a caveat within the carrying capacity of the supporting ecosystems. This is a very convenient definition for designers because basically what we do is we improve the quality of human life. So what we add for a sustainable design is within the carrying capacity of the supporting ecosystems. Instead of me talking in general, I prefer to use case studies. We use case studies in our research. I used case studies for my teaching at Harvard for more than 30 years. So let's focus on case studies that make the point much clearer. And I start with the first case study across the river. It is the Alston extension. It is the Harvard Enterprise Research Campus. And this is being administered by the Harvard Alston Land Company. And basically, it is a redevelopment of a former industrial site into a mixed-use, sustainable, and resilient development. It could be very well one of your studio projects. Let's look who is involved, and there are too many people involved. We see there are two branches here. One branch is about the infrastructure, which is vertical under HALC. HALC stands for the Harvard Alston Land Company. And there is one on the side in orange, the Tishman sprayer team. The infrastructure is preparing the land to receive the buildings. And what you see on the right, the Tishman sprayer team is going to do the buildings in an agreement that basically act as a developer and they're going to run the buildings. What is even more interesting here, in addition to the many organizations involved, is that some of our own are involved, like Studio Gang. Actually, one of my former students when I was teaching structures a long time ago in the 80s, Escape Studio. We also see several engineering firms. I go from the left, TRC, Arup, VHB, WSP. All these firms are supporting our program, the Zofnass Program. But I want to pay attention to one more thing. You see the third in the lower, larger orthogonal here, Lambert Sustainability. There is a sustainability consultant in this group. The project is 600,000 square feet. We see here the first phase, the second phase, we see the buildings, and the sustainability of the infrastructure is limited and focuses on 3 roadways, the utilities, and a greenway, which is shown with the orange line that goes from the left to the right, which is an open public corridor. The sustainability strategies are climate change and resilience, they pay attention to that, energy efficiency, water efficiency, stormwater management, use of healthy materials, and paying attention to indoor environmental quality. Salon Fitzgerald, which is the infrastructure manager, says sustainability and resiliency are core elements of HALC's mission. And she adds, through its design development phase, this project plans to pursue certification from the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure and Vision Rating System. Although the group that I direct, the Zofnass Program at Harvard, it's the developer of Envision, I have to assure you that the decision to use Envision came directly from the consultants. And what do we mean by Envision? Let me go to some basics that they stand on their own in addition to the system. First, we pay attention to quality of life. You remember that we said earlier that our point, our focus is to improve quality of life. And we pay attention to the well-being of people, to mobility, and to the community. And I'm not going to read everything on this slide because this presentation is going to be available to you. However, we simply say that we want to improve health and safety for the broader community and at the same time minimize the negative impact on the surrounding community, which for any human intervention, it's often the case, not always, but often the case. And then pay attention to the lower right. Make the project pedestrian, bicycle friendly, and located near public transportation. Then we go to the second category of what we would like to pay attention, which is the allocation of resources. And when we say resources here, we mean materials, energy, and water. We have 5 different points here. I don't need to read them. They're the obvious ones. This is what you would expect to see. So we have to be very careful what materials we use, their embodied energy, how far away they're being produced, the methods they're produced, but also minimize the use of energy and water. Pay attention that our objective is not to use renewable energy as a first step. The first step is to reduce energy consumption. And after we reduce energy consumption, then we use renewables. We go to the third category, which is the natural world that's being affected by the siting of the project, the conservation of the natural world, and ecology. Here, sometimes the site is given. However, there is always a small opportunity to select where it's going to be. And if you select a former industrial, let me put in quotes, polluted site, then that site is the best for development because we make the assumption, which is a true case, that it's going to be improved. At the same time, one of the important things is we need to manage stormwater, maintain the hydrological functions, and protect the soil health. Let's go to the fourth category, which is climate and resilience. Here we're concerned about 2 things, emissions and resilience. Emissions not to cause climate change to the extent possible that depends on our project, and resilience so that when the climate change happens, because of the actions of many others, sometimes thousands of miles away, then our project is going to stand up. Here, I'm going to pay attention to the 5 different areas that we put on the slide. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have to reduce air pollutant emissions. We have to avoid unsuitable sites, reduce climate change vulnerability, and make the project resilient and adaptable. The 4 areas that I have already presented stand on their own. You don't have to follow Envision. Just think along these lines. Think that you need to improve quality of life. You need to use materials carefully. You need to protect the natural world. And you need to take into consideration that you have to protect the climate and make your project to resist in case something goes wrong. However, there is a 5th category in Envision, which we find it very useful. And this is what we call leadership. This is where we ask for collaboration, planning, taking into consideration all the disciplines, and taking into consideration the economy. We find that this particular fifth direction category facilitates the breaking of silos in a way that we have not seen in the past. Different disciplines work together with the common objective to make a sustainable project because no one can do it on their own. And this is what has become one of the more important characteristics of Envision. So these 5 categories we see on the left have 64 credits, and the project team has committed in the Harvard Alston project to provide evidence for each of the credits and provide a set of quantitative and qualitative indicators. And I pay attention to quantitative because that allows to measure what they're doing. Here we see the credits. I'm not going to read anything here, but at least visually, you can see the categories, the subcategories, and the credits. And I would like to tell you that every credit is rewarded based on the documentation and the intent of the designers and the other disciplines to be above the conventional design. If it is a conventional design gets nothing, but pay attention to the higher achievement possible, which is the restorative. Restorative simply means that you are bringing the site to the prior condition. If it has been contaminated, you bring the conditions, you reverse the conditions. You eliminate cars and you put bicycles, and the bicycles are being used. That is restorative. And I go back to Salon Fitzgerald as I conclude on this project, who says that one of the best advantages to employing a rating system like Envision is the utilization of comprehensive self-assessment tools to balance priorities at the outset, checking alignment with those goals along the way, and affording the opportunity to report back on how the process achieved substantial results. I want here to remind you that when we started with developing this system, which was our objective from setting the Zofnass Program in 2008, was to make possible to compare the positions of many engineering architectural firms that their design was sustainable. The question was, why yours is more sustainable than someone else's? Everybody was using a different tool. The large companies had developed their own tools, and there was not uniformity. So now we can measure, we can compare, and one day when this project is over, we will have evidence on why it was sustainable. Let me go to another project, which again could be your studio project, the rail-to-trail conversion in Greenville, South Carolina. This is an extension of a trail, and the project scope was to design safe and interconnected trail extension of about 5 miles of an existing trail of 22 miles by taking into use an abandoned railway. Also, that was not enough. The scope was to design for community connectivity, mobility expansion, conservation of local culture, and revitalize the downtown through stimulating economic growth. Here we see the plan. We don't have much time to explain every single one of them, but I can simply tell you that 3 days ago, I was walking along these paths and I was biking just to see the project once more. It's a wonderful project. But what impressed me more than the project was how committed were the people from the city of Greenville and the county of Greenville to making this happen. The other thing that really struck my attention was that there are several lines of this trail, and they were calling the lines like the blue line, the red line, the green line. Of course, in Boston, we call the subway with those names, but can you imagine if we start calling the red line, the green line, the blue line, paths that people can take with their bike, they can walk, or they can have their residence nearby. This project has not been rated with Envision officially. However, Judith rated it, Judith Rodriguez from the Zofnass Program, and she found that really it's doing pretty well across all the different areas. Let me grab the opportunity to say that from the very beginning, we decided to separate the rating of quality of life, leadership, resource allocation, natural world, and climate and resilience, so people can compare and know where a project fits better, because the average does not really serve well. And also you have to make your priorities. But what Judith here did beyond that, together with Cristina Contreras, is that they applied this project to see how it meets the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, of the Convention 2030, and put the percentage of how well they fit. All of these SDGs are made for countrywide interventions. They could apply to projects, and that was more as part of our research. So if we look at the SDG 11, which is make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, we see that it's doing almost 70% alignment, which is exactly what people would like to see when they were putting SDG 11. And if you see in the orange rectangle, I have put the SDG 11, the target, so we're referring to targets 2, 3, and 4, and the indicators, and we see how all these particular indicators reflect on the particular project in Greenville. Quite remarkable. Let me continue. Until now, we talked about small projects, infrastructure projects. The last one was, I would call it a landscape infrastructure project. The first one was an infrastructure project of the roadways and the greenway. And here I would like to extend it to cities. And the premise here is that a city is a system of infrastructure plus buildings. So a sustainable city, it's expected to have sustainable infrastructure and sustainable buildings. So our research that was focusing on infrastructure until now started focusing on citywide. And here is a project in Greece, the former airport of Athens. An amazing site, unique in the world, because it is within a very dense urban fabric and provides a unique opportunity for development. And this development can improve the quality of life, not only of the people who are going to live in this area of 1,500 acres, but rather it can propagate the quality of life anywhere else in the greater Athens area. So the approach here is that we have to follow an integrated approach to include urban planning, infrastructure planning, and buildings. The urban planning is going to allow for proximities, and it's going to allow for the use of open space near residences, near offices. It's going to allow for mixed use. Then we plan the infrastructure and the buildings. Let me be more specific about these things. First, we have to start with what are the sustainable strategies. And here what we want is we want a self-sufficient city integrated with the surrounding context. We don't want to make a ghetto within the existing city. Number two, we want to minimize the use of cars. And this is a result of planning We want to restore the coastline and make the waterfront accessible to everybody, create a metropolitan park with cultural and sports activities, create sustainable infrastructures and renewable energy sources, and finally pay attention to the neighborhoods that they have to be self-sufficient, compact, with local shelters and strong connectivity so people can find their basic amenities within their neighborhoods. We looked at 7 infrastructure systems, namely landscape, which, by the way, in our research, we always consider it as infrastructure, transportation, water and wastewater, energy, solid waste, information, and food. Yes, food is an infrastructure. And if you can think about it, it is parallel to water. So when we looked at these 7 areas, we analyzed them and we realized that we have 4 different levels for all of them. And I'm going to go to the levels when I go to the next one, which is about transportation. So I have the opportunity to write a few things next to it. First, we define the demand. In other words, how many people do they need to move? What are the trip generators? What are the trip attractors? So how are we going to meet the need for transportation? By the way, proper planning can reduce the demand. And then we go to the core strategic decisions. How are we going to reflect those? Are we going to use cars? Are we going to put highways within the city? Or we're going to make bike paths and pedestrian paths and pay attention that they do not cross. In other words, the pedestrians do not cross the cars, or they cross at the minimal way. And at the same time, the pedestrians have a safe and pleasant way to walk with a destination, I would say, every 500 feet. And then we go to levels 3 and 4, which is where we design the nodes and the networks. The nodes in transportation are like the stations. The networks are the roads, the railway, the pathways. And this can apply to all 7 infrastructure systems. Let's go to look at the demand. What was the landscape demand for this project? We wanted landscape to support cultural services. We wanted landscape to provide services essential for the other infrastructure systems. And of course, we continued with specific on how we're going to meet the objectives and design guidelines that I do not have time to address today. But what I'm going to address is the buildings. We have a tendency these days to believe that the sustainable building is a building that meets the LEED and gets a LEED award. We see buildings in a different way. We see that buildings are an extension of the infrastructure. We see that the buildings are consuming the product of infrastructure like energy and water, and they actually provide and they make solid waste and they contribute to the landscape. However, buildings being an extension of the infrastructure, they need to consume less, because if the buildings consume less, then we need less infrastructure, we need less installed capacity to produce electricity or to clean water. And at the same time, the buildings can produce energy locally with photovoltaics, for example, or with geothermal. And at the same time, they can recycle water, they can collect water from rain. So we have to see the buildings on how they complement the infrastructure and also number 3 here on this slide, contextually they have to be related to the climate and be integrated to the natural world so they do not overload the infrastructure again. So until now, I'm going to make a stop and continue to the next section. We have talked about improving the quality of human life within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. But we need to add, we need to improve the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems, which actually brings into the game the life cycle behavior of the projects. And here we engaged in research on developing a tool for the sustainability life cycle tool. And the research objective was to develop a tool to integrate sustainability assessment and life cycle assessment. And how did we do that? We started by reviewing the ISO life cycle assessment, which is very well established. Then we reviewed 3 widely used sustainability assessment systems, I would say competitors among themselves, like the Sequel in the UK, ISCA in Australia, and Envision mostly in the United States, but I would say all over the world by now. And then we analyzed the transportation infrastructure project to test our results as a case study. And the case study was a Bayfield Bridge replacement project, a very humble bridge in Ontario. And why in Ontario? Because the project was supported by the National Research Council of Canada. Here we see the Envision performance of this bridge. However, we identified a gap. Not only one, but let me talk about one gap. The gap was that when people design a bridge, they should design it in such a way that major repairs are not happening but very many years later. So they come to the point, the Canadians, to use stainless steel for reinforcement, among other things, because simply stainless steel does not corrode and is going to last much longer. It is a little more expensive, but absolutely pays back when they do not have to rebuild the bridge in a few years. Eventually, our tool addresses the triple bottom line, impacts in the short term and the long term. And when I say about triple bottom line, I mean sustainability of the environment, economy, and social. And finally, we have the tool. It's based on Envision. It is a life cycle self-assessment tool, multiple criteria, a decision-making tool. It is an educational tool for life cycle sustainability and requires, again, evidence-based documentation. Let me continue. And this is our current research. Designing sustainably is quite important, but it's not everything. We have to design for climate change. We have to design for climate resilience. We have to design for climate action. Let's have a quick look at that. We start by developing again a tool that's going to assess projects for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And at the same time, we added a B here, the attractiveness to investments. Why is that? It is because investors have expressed an unprecedented interest in climate action. Many things have happened on climate change. We have to be familiar with all of them, but the year 2015 was the seminal year. It was the year that the Paris 2015 agreement happened. It is the year that the Agenda 2030 produced the SDGs. It is the year that the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate and Financial Decisions, was set up. They have defined the period since then. And the Paris Agreement simply says we have to have net zero emissions by 2050. And here we see a scientific prediction on in order to keep that 1.5 degrees Celsius, when we have to be net zero on CO2 and in greenhouse gases. On the lower part, you see what would happen if the 1.5 degrees were 2 degrees. But I want to focus on the lower part of the slide, and we should all feel very, very proud that our president said that the university, Harvard University, is setting a goal to have the endowment reflect net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which matches the timeline set by the Paris Agreement. So my questions to you is, when your president, both at Harvard and at the White House, both presidents say that we have to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. What are you doing as designers? And should you start doing these things while you're doing your projects at the GSD? So, among the 17 SDGs, the climate action, the 13th, has been identified by the EU political institutions as the most pressing after adopting the UN Paris Climate Change Agreement. However, despite clear climate change objectives agreed, the world is not moving in that direction. We are behind. At the same time, investors started demanding information on climate action. They start asking for non-financial reporting on sustainability. They started asking for what we call the environmental, social, and governance, ESG reporting of the companies before they invest. Why do they do that? Is it because they like the environment? No, it is because they want to have less risk that their investment is going to be doing well in the years to come. So there is a pressure here, and that pressure is a catalyst in pushing sustainability and climate action. So what do? We reviewed Envision and every single credit. We studied the literature. We started the ESG systems, which, by the way, change and improve daily. We talk with industry experts, and we start developing the tool for climate change mitigation based on Envision again, which means that some credits are going to be pushed more than others. And although we see that few credits of Envision are explicitly referring to climate change, you see 12% on adaptation and on mitigation, and you see 13% on adaptation. We really looked at the criteria and all the dimensions of the criteria, all of the fine print, to understand what really, how the climate is being reflected on the credits. And again, we look at case studies. We look at case studies on mitigation adaptation projects, and we selected both case studies in California that leads the nation in terms of sustainability, which California in 2016 raised its goal to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. If these things do not happen, it's going to be a disaster. And you can read it yourself what it is on the slide. The temperature is going to increase by far by 2100. The beaches are going to be lost, and the water supply is going to be declined by 2/3. So unprecedented conditions that's going to reflect on the inhabitants of California and the world. So we started looking at some good examples of a climate mitigation case study, and we found that the California high-speed rail program is an excellent example. And the California high-speed rail program is an amazing project of 77 billion. It's going to go 800 miles from San Francisco to Los Angeles, fully powered by electricity from renewables. It's funded from state and federal sources, and a special authority has been set the California high-speed rail. The project asked ISI to be rated on Envision, and the project scored very high on climate and resilience, 93%, which is really very, very high. Why? Because it reduced embodied carbon, it reduced emissions, and it reduced air pollutant emissions. Not only reduced, but it was restorative. In other words, was bringing things back, which is obvious to think about it, because if we eliminate air travel and car travel, then you can imagine why this brings it back to the prior condition. It's going to be less tons of CO2 being released. Envision has one credit in each one of the categories, which is the innovation credit. I still remember back in 2008, when we were discussing about how to make a rating system like this, it was Dan Schrag from the Center of the Environment who said, Spiro, if we make a multiple choice test, it means that we know all the answers, and we do not allow those who fill the scorecards to be innovative. So what we decided to do was to include one extra credit that says to whoever is using Envision, respond any way you want, above and beyond, give evidence, and you will get extra credits. This is the innovation credit. And this particular project has done very well on the innovation project, having 10 practices or processes that unfortunately I do not have time to go over all of them right now, but really took advantage. And why? Because simply it's a project that addresses climate mitigation in the best possible way. Let's go to another case study. Again, in California, Santa Monica, the Clean Beaches Project. This is more of a climate adaptation. In this case, the challenge was that the stormwater runoff in the ocean was polluting the water, and it was affecting the tourist industry in Santa Monica. So it was brought up to the people to finance this project, and the citizens paid to make this project, which is a project that has a dual objective. First, reduce the beach water pollution, and second, to contribute to Santa Monica's goal towards water self-sufficiency and stop depending on sources outside this boundary to bring water. This project was also rated by SI officially. Here you see the rating on the right, and it's doing really fine. It's not easy to get very high scores, but this is what it got. And basically, the way that it resolves some of the problems is by simply using the gray water, reusing it for irrigation. Here we see the climate and risk category in particular. We see where it got the good points. The prepare for short-term hazards got really a restorative rating. If we go to the next slide, we see that some features of the project. First, the tank that collects the water, the storm water, is under the sea at a lower level, so it does not need pumping, so reduces emissions. The harvested water is used for irrigation, and when they excavated, they use the sand to spread it over the existing beach, so they nourished the beach by what otherwise would need to be tracked out. I change subjects again. Very quickly, I present to you again the Sustainable Development Goals. These exist from 2015. However, there is a new movement right now to create the voluntary local reviews. under the UN European Commission for the Environment. And basically, when the mayors, the Forum of Mayors, met in October 2020, the participating mayors expressed their commitment to work on localizing the SDGs from the country level and requested UNICE to provide support in facilitating the exchange of experiences and best practice and peer learning. I present this to you only with one slide because this is ongoing and we are actively involved. So let me conclude by summarizing what is our vision. And when I say our vision, I don't mean only the group that I direct or I'm working with, but rather I believe the vision of the entire community. First, be responsible. You are the creators of the built environment. Address sustainability and climate change. Second, educate yourselves and the people who work with you in life cycle sustainability and climate action. Build a strong collaborative team with common, uncompromising, but again, realistic objectives. And how can you achieve this vision? It is necessary to establish strong ties with other disciplines and with the industry. You have to engage in applied research, incorporate the research in the learning process, and develop methods and tools to communicate and educate our partners in the building industry. Let me make a pause here and say, if you ask me what is Envision, I would say Envision is an educational tool. It's not a rating tool. It's an educational tool that people who use it are being educated on sustainability. And then what areas should focus on sustainability and climate action? I would say all the GSD programs are immediately related. I would say regional and city planning is pivotal, and infrastructure is at the heart of planning. Landscape is the most critical infrastructure as it takes the larger space in the built and natural environments. And buildings and cluster of buildings are part of the infrastructure affecting demand and supply. So basically, through infrastructure, we see how all our disciplines are all related. So having said that, let me say that I said it explicitly, that we developed Envision. When we developed Envision, there were similar efforts going on by other organizations. We happened to be first, we happened to be successful. So large professional societies approached us. It was 2010. We gave them what we had developed. They started the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, which now is being headed by Anthony Kane, one of the most talented researchers of the Zofnass Program. And now we do common programs, and we have a conference on equitable and sustainable infrastructure in November. You're all invited to attend. More important, at the suggestion of Sarah, we provide the opportunity to GST students to submit a board or media to describe a project. And they will have the opportunity to share the project, their ideas, and their research with the industry, because this conference is attended mostly by industry. They can submit by Google form and respond to simplified and vision-based questions that Judith Rodriguez has put in place. The submissions are going to be editable until the last minute of the deadline to submit. And we have decided that up to 25 submissions are going to be selected to be presented, and we're going to give a stipend, and also the best submission is going to receive an award, and it's going to be judged by 3 members of the industry. So I hope we see many submissions. So this concludes the presentation. You can find more information about us, about the Zofnass Program, about me, about Envision. However, I would like to say that all this work is the work of many people since 2008. It's impossible to refer to all of them. There are hundreds of people who have participated. At the beginning, more than 50 students were employed in this program every year. And given that our students do not stay forever, I would say we had hundreds of people who have participated. So I don't want to take any more credit other than trying to coordinate all this massive effort. And again, thank you very much, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity to share this material.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Spiro. And we have a little bit of time for some question and answer. And we've had several questions submitted already in the chat, which actually, many of which piggyback on things that I actually wanted to start with. And so I had two questions I wanted to start with, and one of them is maybe echoed, let's say, by one of Elizabeth Lee's questions in the Q&A. Where she asks, can you help define quality of life based on the first category of Envision? Have you met people having differing definitions of improving quality of life? And I would expand on that. We both got our PhDs from MIT, but I got my PhD in the one humanities-based PhD you can get at that institution, which is in architectural history. And I guess I want to push at the objective categories of Envision, which many of which are dealing with things that are fairly subjective. And I think Elizabeth pins this immediately with this idea of quality of life. And so I wondered how you grappled with these more subjective sides to the categories of the software and of the indices that you put together. And if you could talk a little bit about how you judge these ideas of how you put a numerical basis to these qualities that are sometimes seemingly hard to pin down.
Right. Let's take the most difficult, of course, is the quality of life. Yeah. And the quality of life, it's something that we can have a working definition. I would definitely avoid to give any definition other than what is used to proceed. It was the very first thing we said. Going back, it was the 1st of February of 2008 in the Center of the Environment. And when we discussed with professors from different parts of Harvard, not only the GSD, and we said quality of life, nobody really questioned how do you define it. So there are some things that they have been going without a strict definition. However, in quality of life, there are 3 subcategories, and the subcategories have credits. And every credit is very well documented on how they're going to get points. So we have to dive deep into every one of the credits. And how did we determine what are the values for those credits? And this came from the industry. In other words, we were lucky enough to have sustainability officers of engineering and architectural firms. At the beginning, there were very few. Then today, every company has a team of sustainability experts. And we simply, in workshops that they were happening every 4 months, we're determining how the credits are going to be given the points. It's not, if you challenge me on any specific credit, and the credit actually requires documentation of several things, every single of the 64 credits, probably we are going to have in the next version of Envision a slightly different rating. But the point is that this is a collective judgment from the industry, from people who are on the front lines of applying sustainability. So answering that question, I would like to go to credits, and of course we don't have time to do it right now, but the manual is available on the web. Now, let me also tell you that because this thing was developed at Harvard, and because we gave it for free to the public domain. The manuals are available in the public domain, available to everybody. So there is not a single document that it is confidential, except for the submissions of the projects, that they are the personal property of those who submit to be. So I know I did not answer you directly what is quality of life. I would like very much to say what it is, and probably the same thing applies to all of them.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, obviously quality of life jumps ahead in terms of something that seems so ephemeral, but even enhancing public space is something that seems quite broad. I like your answer, the idea that it's something that's constantly evolving. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So I assume that means that each time we look at the criteria online, because as you say, this is a publicly accessible document, that it's constantly being updated and upgraded. I wonder if, in addition to having the input from industry, whether you're also having the input from public sectors.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Public sector is very much part of it. And one of the questions at the beginning was, for whom do we develop these things? Mm-hmm. And the answer was, we developed for the public sector. Mm-hmm. We developed it, for example, for the New York City Design, Department of Design and Construction, DDC. We developed it for EPA California. We developed for all those, and they have accepted the system. And unlike LEED, that was applied primarily to developers, knowing that if you have a LEED certification, you sell your building at a higher price or you rent it better. In this case, we work for the public good, and it is for the public sector. So the public sector can compare the proposals they get from the industry.
So that leads to another question that I had, and that is shared by David Del Villar, and some others have also asked questions in this area, which is sort of to what extent this is a universal platform, or to what extent it's American. And I think that's I think particularly if you think of the UN SDGs, how can Envision operate across the world? All of your examples were American.
Yes. Envision is the de facto standard in the United States. As you know, we're a country that we do not have standards. Even the building codes are different from city to city. So this is something that other countries cannot really understand, but this is how it is. It is used all over the world. However, it has two, I would not call them competitors, but other systems that they're really good, which is the Sequel in the UK and ISCA in Australia. I find more difficult to, let me use the word, compete with Sequel, because when I go to former British colonies with very strong ties with the British, that sometimes they joke that, the British have never left. So I find Sequel is their preference. But there is something that I would like to point all people to think about. Envision has two characteristics, the same with Sequel and ISCA. They apply to projects, and they are quantifying the result. So they give you a certain percentage for each of the categories. Mm-hmm. The SDGs, we know the direction we want to go, but you cannot really apply them in the same way. In other words, they tell you what you should do, but they don't tell you how to do it, and they don't tell you how to measure it. And how to measure it, you cannot improve if you don't measure. That was a doctrine we had from the beginning. So the ESGs, for example, they apply primarily to organizations, And again, they're quite subjective. And one of the problems of the financial community at this point is that they do not have unified ESGs, at least right now. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do is we try to be, well, Envision tries to be a standard. Let me also say that Envision is not anymore in our hands. It is in our hands only to the point that we work very close to ISI. Our research continues. And as I told you, our current research is on climate action. So did I answer what you asked me or not really?
So, I mean, there are several questions regarding this idea of whether it's regional within the US or whether it's, also how it relates to global. You have a former student online, Thalia. I'm probably right. She has a Greek name. So as you know, these are very complicated names. We Americans. Yeah, exactly. The Italia Grigard. Yes. I'm butchering your name. I'm sorry, Italia. But she also brought up the Climate Adapt, the European Climate Adaptation Platform, as a parallel, and wondered whether Envision uses that or has any relationship to a platform like that. And so I think there are several questions really about this idea of international parallels.
We found out that Envision can apply to very different regions. We applied it in Malaysia, we applied it in Pakistan, we applied it in Saudi Arabia, and it works. And it works because it has a built-in flexibility. So it's not a matter of the system, it's a matter of how it's going to be supported, because if you want to apply Envision, you can apply it in two different ways. One way is you download the manual, you download the checklist, and you apply it yourself, and then this is what you're doing, basically. Mm-hmm. Alternatively, you can submit the documentation to the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, and they have experts, and the experts rate the project. If you choose to do that, there is a problem that you need to have local experts that you trust. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And at this point, the local experts are only in Europe, based in Italy. So the others, although we have tried to apply the system, it's being applied primarily, I would say, unofficially. Mm-hmm. There was a big project that we undertook with the Asian Development Bank for several projects in South America, and we applied it, but again, unofficially. Mm-hmm. The researchers at the Zofnass Program, they have the expertise. Actually, they are qualified to rate projects, but we cannot stamp the results, if you understand what it is, because we're a university.
Yep, yes. Absolutely. So there's another question, which is less about Envision, and I think more about you as a practitioner and consultant. It's from Shihab Mohammed, who asks if you've ever worked in the Middle East, which I know you have. What is, from your point of view, the main difference a designer should look at or aim for? How do you achieve sustainability in a desert-like area like Egypt, where I'm from? So essentially less about specifically whether this platform can be used in Egypt, but more, I think, about your own practice as you've worked across the world. How have you put on a sort of helmet of understanding these different regions that you're in when you're in different areas?
I would say the desert itself is not a problem. What is a problem is the capacity of the different countries. So when you go to a country that simply they don't have the funding, you cannot be unreasonable and ask the same thing that you would ask in Boston or somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So that's why I try today not to present Envision per se, but present a framework of thinking. Mm-hmm. So if you go with that framework of thinking, you may say, this is not the time to apply Envision. This is the time to look for sustainability, look at the 5 main categories, And the more important in countries like Egypt would be to start with leadership. In other words, are people committed to sustainability? What are the drivers for sustainability? And depending on the support you have, you can push so much or you can be so much flexible. I'm talking here, Sarah, about the concept that you probably know from MIT pretty well, the reflective practitioner. That you can do so much as you can convince your client to do. And but nevertheless, if you start talking about the different things and if you start presenting the credits and say, let's see how we can improve for the benefit of all, and then achieve the most you can achieve with the less possible resources.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate this sort of the broad umbrella of there's a side to all that you're doing that part of me wants to say should just simply be common sense, right? That one hopes the world understands these as shared principles and common sense. This fits actually nicely with Carol Kutz's question, where she or he, I'm sorry, Carol, it's spelled this way, I think it's a male name, who says, love Spiros' note about how we should make sure we build buildings that consume less, not just buildings that source their energy in better ways. It seems like some of this consumption is dependent upon design, but I assume most of it is dependent upon use and user intake. So the question is, what can we do beyond education to actually guide people to consume less through design? Are there ways we can design our built environment that actually encourages people to use less, discourages people from using more? What does that look like?
Well, I think the answer is in what Carol said, which is education.
Yeah.
All these things do not apply if you do not have an educated set of actually people who are going to be sustainable. Let me give you an example here. Masdar was a city that was pushing sustainability to the extreme in Abu Dhabi. One of the features was that the showers were operating for 3 minutes with very little water, and every 3 minutes you had to turn on the faucet again. The result is that was a forced economy for using water. And we know that the users, although they were highly educated, because some of them were at the local university, the Masdar Institute of Technology, they were resisting that. So there is so much you can push with regulation. Nevertheless, nowadays we have been used to using less water with faucets that they comply to certain gallons per minute, but primarily it's education. You have to feel really nervous when you see the faucet running water for no reason. If you don't feel nervous, if you don't feel like I need to go there and shut it off, then we have not achieved anything.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. And I wonder if, simply encouraging this conversation with younger and younger constituents to make it more naturalized, as I think it is. If I think of the desires of our students, it's many of the things you talk about are, I think, common sense for them. We have a question from Chris Ford. This is maybe related, where Chris is saying, if we recognize the majority of infrastructure design occurs in disciplines other than architecture, and as you said, landscape and urban and regional planning really have maybe more obvious a tie to infrastructural planning than architecture. Chris says, what recommendations or strategies might you have for architects looking to pivot themselves and perhaps a larger discipline of architecture towards infrastructure design?
Well, I always try to distinguish between formal education and how we practice. So if you're thinking about an architect who does only private houses, you can do certain things, but if you're an architect like the researchers in the Zofnass Program, that we have many architects, but they are willing to dive deep in other areas because their formal education was in architecture, but they wanted to be more involved in planning and in looking at the bigger picture. But let's say that someone wants to do only buildings. The questions are very simple. how your building can consume less. How can consume less in a way that you take into consideration building physics as opposed to building mechanics? Mm-hmm. How can you consume less by having the proper insulation, by simply not using elevator in every floor? I can go on forever, but don't using air conditioning at times that you do not need air conditioning. And then the next thing, how can you produce energy? And you produce energy in a very simple way. Either you put photovoltaics, either on the roof or on the side of the building, or you put a wind turbine on top of your building or on the land, or you use geothermal. It's very simple. Mm-hmm. And if you go a step further with water, consume less water by using special fixtures that they use less water, but more important, recycle the water, collect the water from rain. I was in a federal building a few days ago, and they had 18,000 gallons tank buried that they collect rainwater, and then they have tanks above the surface that they pump to those tanks, and then from there, with gravity, they use it to irrigate the site. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That way, they don't have to use municipal water for irrigating site. And I still remember people from Holland, when they tell me, students from Holland, it's unthinkable that the same water that we drink, we use it to flush the toilet. These are some very simple. So architects can do a lot. And they have to make sure that the plumbers do not actually make all the connections properly.
Exactly. And I also think that part of it is communicating among the different disciplines. And so, obviously we're back in the building here at Gunn. And so ideally the students can learn how to make these connections among themselves in their conversations in the trays. We have a question that I think is quite interesting from Dimitris Papanikolaou.
Yes,
getting close, who asks, how do you evaluate the design of an evaluation system? How do you know if the evaluation system evaluates and rates other systems in an objective manner if you're the one who decides this, especially if the evaluation system balances multiple diverse criteria? I mean, I think it's an interesting question in terms of if you're setting up a system, how do you know if the system is working properly, and how do you evaluate the system?
It's like your own child, you're biased. However, as an academic, you're never biased, as you know, or at least I want to believe that. So let me tell you an example here. For the Allston project, the team evaluated several systems, and they chose Envision. So they did not choose it because of Harvard. They did not choose it because that was the only one they knew. They compared the others and they chose it. So that is actually a proof that the system must be good since they chose it. Furthermore, when we did the research with the Canadians, we decided to look at 3 different systems in detail, as I said before. And this is where we had our academic hats, and we said, we're not going to favor Envision. And we looked at that and we found that the others had some drawbacks. One drawback was that both of the other 2 systems, SQL and ISCA, were more complicated. One advantage of what we have done is to have something that it is relatively simple as it can be given the complexity of the project. So I can say to Dimitri, and he was there doing his doctorate when we were developing these things, and Dimitri was involved very much with mobility at that time. We started with about 90 credits, and we had actually, the industry told us, reduce it. So every time they were coming back, we had less and less and combining. Mm-hmm. So simplicity is important because otherwise people are not going to use something. So how do we know that it is the best? I'm not sure if it is the best. As I say I will go back to Malaysia, as I will say to Malaysians, I want you to use Envision because I know how to use it. And if you work with me, it's better to use Envision. But if you want to use SQL, it's fine. By the way, talking about Malaysia, let me give you a dimension of the problem. I happened to be there when they had these tremendous floodings. So the situation was that the water table was exactly where the flooding was. So there was no way to pump anything out. And at the same time, the irony was that the water supply had been damaged. So they were in the water without fresh water to drink. And we were talking to the people there, and they said, we cannot find actually what can we do here? How can we protect it? Because again, it is like the rice fields, the water is really high. And it's not like what we see in other parts of the country, even the US, that we saw the flooding from either, but then slowly it was dissipated in the soil. So these are really very big problems. And anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I encourage anyone to look at the Zofnass website and sort of, I mean, even the examples that you cited, the cases that you cited, I think the variety of what defines infrastructure and how these climate problems intersect, frankly, the way that we all live our lives is very interesting. And I think it's fascinating the number of cases that you come across. I'll end with one last question, which was actually one of our first questions from a current GSD student who's interested in doing research with Zofnass and the Envision program and wants to know how she can get involved or who she can connect with, and wants to thank you for the informative presentation. And I know that you did point people to the fall conference, and that's also in the chat from Paige Johnson to everyone. But I wondered if you wanted to conclude by one last message essentially to the students.
The message is that whoever wants to work, we have a place. Our attitude from the very beginning is to work with as many people as they want to come and work with us. It's not important, actually, how limited or how much work we have. We have plenty of things to be done. We don't have the capacity. And at the same time, the purpose of having the program at the GSD is educational. And the best way to educate people is to work side by side and ask them to do things. And doing things right or wrong is not very important as long as they do things and they learn. So this is our attitude. Please send me an email. The person on campus who is handling actually the boards and the media is Judith Rodriguez. She's highly qualified as an Envision expert. She's one of our own. She was an honor student at the GSD. And so, yes, please contact us. And if you're ready, we're going to start today.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again, Spiro. It's a never-ending current topic, very, very important and current topic. And I am keen to see what happens with the infrastructure bill with all of your work in the back of my mind as I listen to the news in the evening. So thank you very much. I'm still jealous of the fact that you are in Greece and I am sitting here in rainy Cambridge. But I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. And thank you again for a very interesting lecture.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the opportunity. Terrific.